Today, we're taking a close look at Rembrandt's self-portrait at the age of 34. As we zoom in on some exquisite details, explore perhaps unexpected connections between Amsterdam and Italian art, and dive into why Rembrandt might have chosen to dress himself in a style that had gone out of fashion for more than a century. So to start off, what do we see? The Dutch master depicted himself in half-length, with his body turned 3/4 to the right and his head turned a little more towards the viewer. He confidently locks eyes with us. His arm is firmly placed on top of this wooden ledge or sill, and his elbow is protruding towards us, while his hand is sort of resting against his tummy. Rembrandt pays careful attention to how the light illuminates the skin of his face, showing its imperfections and the early signs of aging. And look at the careful shadows created by the cap and the sense of depth this creates in the face. Rembrandt painted this in 1640, when he was living in Amsterdam and was considered the go-to portraitist in the Netherlands. Ever since he moved there from the city of Leiden, some 8 years earlier, he had amassed great success and had steadily climbed the social ladder. He had all these important commissions from fancy clients, and he'd married up by wedding Saskia van Uylenburg, who came from a wealthy and well-connected family. In 1639, Rembrandt had been able to make the first payment on a very large and beautiful house. So at this moment in time, he was completely on top of his game. This self-portrait, in a way, reflects this high status, not only through the confident gaze and the self-assured pose, but also through his choice of clothes. On top of his curly head of hair, he wears a cap with the underside decorated with ornaments. He's dressed in a heavy, brown, expensive-looking jacket trimmed with fur, which has these big, poofy, dramatic sleeves. And just look at the finely embroidered edge at the neck of his shirt. Now, it might not be immediately apparent for us today, but these garments were no longer in style at the time. And this is not the only historic reference. With this painting, Rembrandt is placing himself in the tradition of several portraits by famous artists of the past. One striking comparison is to a portrait painted a century and a quarter earlier by Titian, the Italian master who was already very famous in Rembrandt's day. The Dutch painter had most likely seen this work, or possibly a close copy of it, in a private collection in Amsterdam. He then borrowed the pose, with the arm dressed in an impressive sleeve, and placed on the ledge. And it's a wonderful coincidence that these two works both ended up at the National Gallery. The man in Titian's portrait was, in the 17th century, erroneously thought to be the famous Italian Renaissance poet Ariosto. So this painting was made by the great Titian and was, in the mind of Rembrandt, of a great poet. And it's safe to assume that Rembrandt did not unintentionally give his self-portrait a similar appearance. But it's not easy to work out what his exact purpose was. Rembrandt was perhaps interested in presenting himself and his art as part of a tradition embodied by Titian and Ariosto. There's a good chance that he was indulging in emulatio of Titian, which is the endeavor to match another in something. This idea of emulation was as popular as ever in the Dutch Republic. Dutch artists taking on each other, but also the Italians of the past, was ingrained in their ambition through the prevailing theories on art and their practical training. Many Dutch and Flemish artists visited Italy as part of this artistic training, but Rembrandt never made the trip. One day, Constantijn Huygens, who was the secretary to the Prince of Orange and was one of the most powerful tastemakers of the day in the Dutch Republic, visited the young Rembrandt in his studio in Leiden. He urged him to go to Italy, but Rembrandt famously replied no. He simply had no time, and many of the best Italian paintings were in the Netherlands anyway, he said. And although we can daydream about a slightly less stubborn Rembrandt, who did go to see the Sistine Chapel and all the other good stuff in Italy, and about the effect it may have had on his work, Rembrandt wasn't completely wrong either. There were quite a couple of exquisite collections of Italian art in the Netherlands at the time, as were there many copies and drawings and prints to study. And this self-portrait really beautifully illustrates this process of international inspiration and rivalry and emulation without the artist ever leaving the country. Through his work, Rembrandt made his face very accessible and recognizable to his many admirers, both during and after his lifetime. He depicted himself many times in etchings and drawings and paintings from his early days in Leiden to the year of his death. There is the pitfall of overinterpretation when you study these self-portraits in the context of his life and what was going on in it, but there is an undeniable autobiographic element to at least some of them. The self-portrait at the age of 34 is considered a high point in his work, made in what was to be a high point in his turbulent life. In choosing this pose and the 16th century dress, Rembrandt was, more than in the earlier self-portraits, showing off the status that was due to him and his art. His appearance in this painting has often been described as confident, and some have even called it arrogant. Others praise its qualities of complete calmness. And perhaps this ambiguity is also one of the keys to why you can just keep on looking at it. With this impressive image, Rembrandt actively placed himself in an artistic tradition of the greats. And that might just summarize the vibe of this self-portrait. We are in the presence of one of the greats, and boy, does he seem to know it.